Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the conference. We're now moving on to the second panel. And before the panel begins, let me kindly remind that each speaker is allocated for 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation, while discussants have 10 to 15 minutes. Our second panel is focusing on the topic of economic security and supply chains. The three panelists are Professor Ronald Mendoza from Antonio de Manila University, Professor Arthur Shipke from National University of Singapore, and Professor Halukata Takenaka from the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. We also have two discussants, Professor Dunren Zheng from TSE National Tsinghua University and the College of William and Mary, and Professor Hans Tong from National Taiwan University and TSE National Tsinghua University. The panel will be chaired by Professor Anthony Sage, the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia and Dayu Professor of International Affairs from Harvard Kennedy School. Now let us welcome Professor Sage.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think one of the most remarkable things has been the shift of discussion over the last few years. If we look back to the turn of the century, all the talk was about World Trade Organization, globalization, trade liberalization. And I think if the students of those years heard the words now, they'd be quite shocked by the shift in a lot of the language and the dynamics. Now the more common phrases we hear are de-risking, friendshoring, and for China, dual circulation and made in China 2025. I think we see two phenomena driving part of this. The first of these is the securitization of economies, and that has also led to the revival of a much more explicit industrial policy in many countries. Is very noticeable, of course, with the Biden administration, with the securitization of the economy. But actually, it began much earlier in China in 2008, for example. It banned Facebook and Google explicitly on security grounds that they might be providing information to Washington. And then secondly, of course, is the major reorganization of supply chains, not necessarily deglobalization, as Heiwei was talking about in the earlier this morning. But we're certainly seeing reorganization in different dynamics, especially regionalization. Previously, China actually took the brunt, good and bad, of outsourcing, but now that's being spread across other countries, playing out in different ways. So to help us think about these questions and challenges, we have three great panelists, as were presented just now. And I'll begin with Ronald Mendoza, who we should congratulate, has a new position now working in the Philippines Department of Education, overseeing policy and planning. So over to you, Ronald.
Thank you very much. The downside of this recent appointment is that I will strictly stick to my script here. First, thank you so much for the kind invitation to participate in today's conference. Hans, Tony, and the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science. You have a very nice campus, and I see a very international student body, which I'm sure is a strength for the program. This is a very impressive conference, and I learned a lot from this morning's presentations. And I hope I can contribute a little bit with this very practical intervention. I wrote this as part of my contribution to our development planning in the Philippines, because I thought our economists and our national security people were not necessarily sort of talking to each other in a very proactive way. So I tried to sort of put together some thoughts on the economics of national security and how national security must also be reflected in our economic planning. And so the main gist of my short talk is what are the implications on countries like the Philippines? So originally this was a short article for developing countries. And the thesis was, if this will be a period of turbulence and uncertainty, what are the development prospects for countries like this? So geopolitical risks and economic de-risking, challenges and opportunities for developing countries writ large, but in particular the Philippines. So I'll just go ahead and read from my script here. In May 2023, the group of 7 nations representing about 27% of the world economy committed to de-risk and not decouple from China, opting for a constructive and stable relationship with China, even as they reduce their dependence on Chinese trade. Now, very practically, country profiles obviously vary, and main risks here are often threefold. First is risk of economic interlinkages being used as political leverage. We know this as economic coercion. This is not new. We are used to this from the previous Cold War. Maybe now it is also again being revived in addition to industrial policy. Second, risk of economic disruption in the event of conflict or other geopolitical shocks. And we have seen a lot of this from the Ukraine conflict and certainly now also from the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and its impact on energy prices. And finally, the risk of geopolitical rivalry undermining economic development goals. And this is key for the Philippines for reasons that are quite obvious, and you don't need me to sort of overemphasize this. For a country like the Philippines, the first 2 risks likely apply and require risk mitigation strategies, while the third risk, faced by its defense and economic allies like the United States, Japan, and others, likely opens opportunities for the Philippines to engage in the recalibration of investments and regional value chains. The Philippines recently ramped up both defense and economic partnerships under the Marcos administration in a possible bid to develop a more diversified network of defense and economic partnerships. And I'll just give you a few examples here. In September 2023, the Philippines and Australia announced an initiative to enhance their strategic partnership, covering the breadth of their bilateral political and strategic relationship, including defense and security, maritime security cooperation, counterterrorism, and combating transnational and organized crime, critical infrastructure security, non-proliferation, arms and export controls, and a variety of other issues. After the trilateral summit of the US, Japan, and the Philippines in Washington, D.C. in April 2024, just this year, the 3 countries agreed to explore how to strengthen the resilience of supply chains for critical minerals, notably nickel. You, of course, know the importance of nickel in this country because it is part of what you need to produce all those semiconductors. The Philippines is the 2nd largest producer of nickel ore after Indonesia, while China is the 2nd largest producer of refined nickel. The 3 countries also unveiled their plans to support the Luzon Economic Corridor, which would channel about $100 billion in investments in northern Philippines. And this is key for us, obviously, in our infrastructure push, but also in our greater connectivity with our northern economic partners. That includes Taiwan, for instance. In September 2024, the Philippine Senate ratified the free trade agreement between the Philippines and South Korea with the endorsement of 13 government agencies. This complements pre-existing defense partnership with the South Korean government, which is underpinned by defense industry cooperation supporting modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines. So as you know, some of our ships and our FA-50s are coming from South Korea, and we welcome the transfer of technology and capability in this sector as well. In June 2023, the Philippines and India launched negotiations on a bilateral PTA during the 5th India-Philippines Joint Commission on Bilateral Cooperation. Prior to that, India revised its long-standing position on the South China Sea by supporting the Philippines' territorial claims over China. This revised stance also comes with India's increased security partnerships with countries in Southeast Asia. And in April 2024, earlier this year, India delivered the first BrahMos supersonic missile systems to the Philippines, being the first export customer of the weapon system co-developed by Indian and Russian firms. In January 2024, Vietnam and the Philippines agreed to enhance cooperation between their coast guards in order to help prevent incidents in disputed parts of the South China Sea. The 2 countries, of course, have overlapping maritime claims in the sea as well. And they signed the Memoranda of Understanding on the 2nd day of Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s state visit to Vietnam earlier this year. And finally, the European Union developed Indo-Pacific strategies aimed at enhancing maritime presence in the region. Naval warships from France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom and the Netherlands were deployed for freedom of navigation operations in the West Philippine Sea. Recently, France has also stationed a defense attaché in Manila for the first time, held the Pegasus 2024 mission in the Philippines to demonstrate the agility of French aircraft in the region, and even initiated discussions for a visiting forces agreement. Alongside closer cooperation for maritime security, formal discussions between the Philippines and the EU are taking place for a bilateral free trade agreement. So all of these are examples of this recent move, spur of activities to diversify our economic and security partnerships, but most importantly also the economic part of these partnerships. And here's the reality for a country like the Philippines. And here, I may have no answers in my article, but this is the challenge for thinkers perhaps like Dean Danny and all our thinkers in the Philippines on how to balance this. Nevertheless, China plays an outsized role in certain technologies so that developing countries like the Philippines will end up paying higher prices should they decide to switch away from Chinese products in a big way. This is the case for automobiles. China produces 1/3 of the world's cars. Electronic vehicles, China produces more than half of the EVs in the world. And similarly, key areas of clean energy, so Dean Danny mentioned this earlier, manufacturing, which are presently dominated by Chinese firms. For example, in solar energy, China accounts for anywhere from 75 to 95% of global production of key inputs, such as solar cells, solar modules, solar wafers, and ingots, among other products. In the much contested semiconductor manufacturing sector, and we all know the strategic importance of semiconductors in today's world, China is able to compete in downstream activities such as assembly, testing, and packaging, as well as some wafer foundry, but it still lags in chip design, which is presently dominated by firms from the US, Japan, and South Korea. Hence, maintaining access to international markets for a variety of products, including those cost-effectively produced by China and China-linked value chains, will be key to Philippine economic strategy in the years moving forward. This is just the pragmatism of navigating this kind of a situation. I'll end with a few thoughts on de-risking and how developing countries can start to think about this, and certainly for the Philippines, this is quite relevant. Industrial and developing country policymakers need to consider several issues linked to de-risking. First, government intervention will likely be necessary, as one cannot expect firms to voluntarily de-risk to the extent that they will absorb the full cost of mitigating the national security and economic development risks associated with geopolitical shocks to trade and investments. This is, my analogy here is a financial crisis or an economic crisis. No single firm will internalize the full social cost of any of these crises. So why would we expect anything different from a geopolitical shock? Second, most cost-effective de-risking of specific international supply and production chains likely requires collective action across firms and across national policy-making communities because of the nature of the value chains. Here, a greater number of countries and firms involved in the trade and investment recalibration can theoretically be expected to produce more diverse, less costly, and ultimately more successful options for production chain realignment. So I completely agree with some of the views expressed this morning that the bigger these groups of countries may be, mini multilateralism, as I think was the term used, will likely reach this economic feasibility more strongly than if it were like smaller groups. And finally, shared values, and here I would like to draw on the work of folks like Professor Danny Rodrick, who has been invoked several times in this conference. I wish he were here. He was actually my professor along with Professor Tony Sage some years ago. I won't tell you how many years ago. But if Danny were here, he would have probably emphasized some of this stuff also. Finally, shared values and institutional commonalities will clearly matter, as countries with democratic and free market systems may have developed institutional features that are much more compatible, even as this aspect is not always reflected in firm-level decisions during the previous globalization period. In today's globalization period, this is probably going to be part of the premium as far as some countries navigating this space. Before we traded goods, and then we traded services, now we're trading data and information. How did you get that data and information? What kind of protections did you provide to your citizens? Trade and investments in technology that invoke network externalities, 5G, and information flows are particularly relevant here. institutions, laws, and oversight mechanisms that protect consumer privacy and prevent perceptions manipulation in order to build trust in these systems will be crucial, along with the broad societal and political debates that will need to clarify and form consensus around these important nuances. The paper is slightly longer, but I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald. I think the Philippines is an interesting case, and it highlights both the increasing securitization of the economy, and also I think is a classic example of what I referred to as Asia's double dilemma, where you're wrestling with the issues of the economic engagement and how to mitigate that with what has been extraordinary in terms of the contestation with China over the maritime issues and so forth, and the increasing closeness as a result with the US security umbrella. So let me turn secondly then to Alfred Schipka, who's professor in practice and the director of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore.
Could we bring up the slides? Yep, thank you. Technology and patience. Thank you very much. What I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about setting the stage in terms of some of the restrictions that have been imposed, and then analytically walk through a number of categories. One, which we have already partly discussed, how geopolitics is impacting trade. The second part, how it is impacting foreign direct investments and overseas direct investments. And then highlight a part that I think is an interesting part, at least from China's perspective, and that is its strategy as it relates to technology and technological partnerships. And then I will finish up with a hypothesis about how China's economic model ultimately is going to generate shocks globally that potentially can increase the tensions and maybe emerging responses from the Chinese side itself. So, in terms of setting the stage, we have already talked about it. It is reflected in the fact that we have trade measures being imposed globally. Here, the green line are liberalizing measures, and the red line and the blue line, that's the total shows you a drastic increase in trade measures. And of course, that's not surprising to anybody here in the room. Now, when it comes to the specific measures that matter for China, on the one, you have, of course, tariffs that are being imposed, but it's not only limited to, it is also the reaction of countries by engaging in industrial policies and by providing subsidies. And then more recently, you see that here on the right-hand side these are new measures so far that is reflected in the data. That is public procurement, where countries now pursue more nationalistic objectives, and of course that has implications for China as well. Now, there are a few terms that probably 10 years ago nobody would have used, at least not that often. One is geopolitics, national security. Of course, here in the region also the South China Sea issue, trade tensions. But the ones that clearly stand out, and this is the frequency of how these terms are used in news publications, it is especially national security and geopolitics. And I think here, if one were to do an analysis, the question is, what is the chicken and the egg? Because I think these are self-reinforcing. The more often these terms are being used, the more likely it ultimately is then also reflected in actions either by the business community or governments. So what are the implications of that? We have talked a little bit about this earlier. We have shifting global alliances where trade relations are being redefined in response to these new geopolitical relationships. It is then also reflected in trade policies. For example, China itself now articulates very clearly that it wants to go out and focus on the global south and, of course, also ASEAN countries. That ultimately then leads to emphasis on new alliances. When it comes to Europe, the story is a little bit more differentiated, and I'll come back to that in a second. And of course, the other one is withdrawing from trade altogether by bringing global value chains back home. Those are the broader directions. And this, of course, reflected in the data that we have so far. And that is for the first time last year, merchandise exports exceeded those to the BRI countries compared to the G7 and EU. And this is a very conservative definition of the BRI because, as you know, some of the Eastern European countries are also part of the BRI, but we have excluded them. So this is truly non-EU countries, non-G7 countries. So we already see that in reality. As was already indicated earlier, that is, of course, also reflected in the fact that U.S. trade has been diverted, but as a share of value added, as indicated earlier, that has actually not only remained the same, it is actually slightly going up, in particular through countries such as Mexico and Vietnam, through the redirection of value chains. Now, globally, China is still doing relatively well, and actually it increased its share of global trade to 14.4%. Maybe another factor to point out here is that the U.S., Mexico and Canada basically have maintained the share. All right, that's the trade side. So how is that being reflected in investments? And I think this is where the story is starting to become interesting. We'll see a lot more action going forward in our assessment. Largely because of restrictions imposed by recipient countries, host countries, that often now use national security arguments, often not very clearly defined. that can be changed at a whim. They're not transparent, not very good for foreign direct investments. And then the whole compliance cost, even if you could qualify, the cost of actually making that work has gone up. And so what we're seeing is almost a mirror image on the trade side as it relates to FDI, and that is for China, investments in regions with more favorable relations. Again, strategic realigns the importance of the Belt and Road, the announcements that have been made, including in Africa more recently. And in general, basically targeting investments toward countries that are considered to be more friendly toward China. Maybe there's another part, and I think there the verdict is still out a little bit, but what we've seen so far and the policy announcement that we have heard from China is that it's a lot more cautious to invest in sensitive sectors. They're also concerned about technology transfer to other countries. And again, the full support of the government to foster this broader strategy of diversifying FDI. So maybe there are two parts to it. One is related to the more political situation. Here, this map shows countries that voted in favor of condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the ones in red are the ones that did not vote or abstained, voted no or abstained. And that now is reflected also in the direction of foreign direct investments. You can see this here in the figure on the left-hand side. These are greenfield foreign direct investments per year. And what you can see clearly is that there are more investments going to countries that condemned Russia. This is at the global scale. Now, where is at the global scale? Where are foreign direct investments going to? Advanced Europe and the United States are still the largest recipient of foreign direct investment. China, has an important part, but is not the major recipient. As a matter of fact, if we look at the flows to key countries in the world, what you can see is that China is negatively impacted by the geopolitics, the uncertainty that exists. Here, the red portion is China, and the latest data that we had for 2022. These are greenfield investments and merger and acquisitions, again, reflecting the new realities. China's own foreign direct investments, where are they going to? Well, as already indicated, basically to more friendly countries. Here you can see the light green bar at the top, maybe on the right-hand side. It's the ASEAN countries. The darker green one is the Middle East, North Africa. Maybe one major part to notice is that foreign direct investments in India have come down dramatically, not surprisingly, I would say. Now, there are certain parts that particularly benefit in terms of the FDI, and it's in the broader range of EVs, original equipment, manufacturing, and here the biggest beneficiary are ASEAN countries. Okay, so we have trade and foreign direct investments, and one can think of maybe a third category, and that is technology. And here, this is, I think, the part where a lot of action is likely to take place over the next couple of years, and I don't know how it will ultimately end up. What we're seeing is, and I would call it almost a paradigm change, China's technological partnerships with countries across the globe, in particular in Europe. Here are just for the EV market some of the major collaborations, joint ventures with European car makers, and these are relatively large. Let me go back to this one. Okay. I think here the key is that certain countries, especially in Europe, that had comparative advantages in the past, let's think about the car industry, basically have lost that comparative advantage overnight. They are behind not only battery, but they're also behind the IT. This is where only 2 countries in the world basically have the infrastructure, which is the United States and China. And so now what we're seeing is a reversal of what we saw in the 1970s. You might recall joint ventures of European car companies in China, where you had 49% shareholdings of the European companies, 51% by China, and the chairperson was a Chinese. We have a reversal of that. The latest European joint ventures is 49% shares of China, CEO is Chinese, and 51 European. And that is truly, for some Europeans, and I think especially the German car manufacturers have been very open, a way to maintain competitiveness globally, because if they don't catch up, they are 3 years behind on the IT side for cars, they might lose out globally. Now, I thought maybe just at the very end also highlight maybe another part that was already mentioned earlier. Of course, we're about to finish up a background paper on China's AI. If anybody is interested, we're more than happy to circulate this. Here, of course, one important factor is some of the investments, as already indicated earlier, that is needed for AI. In effect, only 2 countries in the world have right now, which is the US private capital and maybe China that mobilizes to some degree public capital. Now, of course, China is behind and is unable to acquire the highest technology. But there is a sense in China that despite that constraint, they can do extremely well, and that is more focused on specialized AI. In particular, what they called generative AI in physical form that can be used for autonomous EVs, robots, and that's where they think ultimately, even with chips that are not at the cutting edge, they will be able to dominate the market. That is equally kind of reflected in the other competition right now, and that when it comes to autonomous driving, where we have 2 types of technology. One is the camera only, which is Tesla, and Tesla has a significant advantage here. And then the other one that China is using, and that is a laser focused, where the costs have come down dramatically, and many believe because of the cost advantage compared to Tesla, it might actually be able to be successful in selling that technology in the cars globally as well. So in general, despite all the headwinds, China is of the view that it has a competitive niche even in the IT sector. And then let me come up with a little bit of a hypothesis that I think has caused some of the tension. Some of them are related to some broader geopolitical issues that go maybe beyond China per se, or at least the economic part, but I would argue there's another component. And that has to do with what we have seen is in a certain kind of way when it comes to economic policy making, that decision making has been elevated not only to the highest level of the central government, but the political leadership. Now, what that does is when the political leadership makes announcements about new sectors and strategic sectors, China has, and we've done some studies on this, being able to mobilize resources at a speed that is almost unrivaled. And that means, given China's size, that whichever sector benefits from that and then potentially experiences quick price falls will be able to become competitive globally very quickly. And given China's global footprint, that can cause challenges. And I think we have seen that in the EV market. What does it mean? It means immediate spillovers. So if you're on the other side of the particular sector that was identified as a key sector where resources from the banking sector, from state-owned enterprises, from regional and local governments, and also from the private sector immediately start focusing on that sector and have access to financing, then depending on who you are in the rest of the world, you might welcome the export of a particular product, especially if you don't have that industry, and it can help you with your own development. But if you're an advanced economy that has a sector that would potentially compete, you're now confronted with severe competition. And if you're an emerging market, including here in ASEAN, that has the ambition to compete, that of course also then creates tension. It is interesting to see how China is starting to react, because it is, of course, starting to internalize the reaction from the rest of the world. I think the two that I discussed earlier, more foreign direct investments, and then secondly, technological partnerships could be the answer. So instead of just trade, which immediately creates trade tensions, you're trying to overcome that by having maybe foreign direct investments or technological cooperations. And there is another part that has emerged as part of the discussion with the European Union, and that is, well, we know we're threatening sectors. I'll give you a specific example. If you come from Germany, every 7th to 10th job is in the car industry. If that car industry tomorrow is threatened by China's EV market, no political system could survive that. And that, of course, is what you're seeing right now in Europe. So China has started to discuss maybe some voluntary export constraints or maybe some export tariffs to manage this. And again, in our view, the phenomenon of what we've seen in the EV sector is something that is likely going to repeat itself in other sectors that have already been identified because of the quick and large mobilization of resources and the large size of China. And I just wanted to leave you with the final vote on the EV tariffs that Europe imposed, and we'll see what the final verdict will be. But interesting enough, you look at some of the countries that voted against it, those are also the ones that have received significant foreign direct investments from China. I highlighted Spain, that used to be on the side of voting against, in favor of the tariffs. China made an announcement, Xi Jinping made an announcement to invest. Initially, Spain indicated that they would be against it. They turned out to abstain. But what I'm trying to say is, in a certain kind of way, there is a certain level of receptiveness. So I would expect that this will continue. So what are the takeaways? Again, the likelihood that we'll have continued increases in trade restrictiveness is very, very high. It has impacted, as was indicated earlier, the trade dynamics in a way that maybe not everybody would have expected. And we'll see how this plays out once and when we know who's going to be in the White House. What we do see clearly is a reorientation of trade toward more China-friendly countries, especially the BRI countries. And that is mirrored on the FDI side as well. And based on my hypothesis before, I would expect more to happen. The other part, and this is again a certain kind of paradigm change, this new technological collaboration. I think we would be a little bit more skeptical when it comes to technological cooperation with the United States. But I think other parts of the world, especially Europe, but maybe also in ASEAN countries, is likely going to become more important. And despite China's constraints, especially on the chip side, it is relatively confident that it will do well, both in terms of AI, but more smaller models, specific models, also autonomous driving. And then, as I ended the previous slide, this issue that in a certain kind of way, China's decision-making process on major strategic sectors, given that it has been elevated to the highest level of leadership, will and its size and the speed at which can mobilize resources is likely going to continue to create tensions. There are early signs that at least some in China are aware of this and want to potentially minimize that while also, of course, being successful in its export or global strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfred. I think that gives a nice sophisticated view when we try and think about what's often talked about with decoupling and showing the complexity where a lot of people talked about the easiest area to decouple would be in the trade sector between US and China. I think this is a good example of showing how that's playing out differently. FDI and tech, I think, will be different sort of resolutions to that. But it seemed to me that what you're describing is, from China's perspective, they're engaging in two different types of risk mitigation. One is geoeconomic, including what you were talking about by conclusion, and then there's also the kind of geopolitical risk mitigation, which is also taking place. Our third speaker is Professor Takanaka, who is the professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Please.
Oh, thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking President Kao and Professor Saish for organizing this conference, and I'd like to give, I'm grateful to Professor Tain Jai Chen for inviting me for this conference, and also Professor Yves Tiberghien, my old friend, to give me a chance to get to know Professor Chan in this February. And also, I'm very grateful to the people and friends in Taiwan for giving huge donations, about 2.5 million yen, for the earthquake which took place in this January in northwestern part of Japan. Thank you very much. And this is, once again, you provided us a huge amount of donations when the great East earthquake took place, 2011. So you always help us whenever some earthquake or natural disasters hit Japan. I appreciate that very much. Thank you very much. And so I would like to provide overview of evolution and development of Japanese economic security policy in this presentation. And I understand that the organizer of the conference wants to examine the effects of US-Japan tensions over economic security policies of various countries. So I try my best to show how the tensions between the United States and United States and China has affected our economic security policies. So I would like to make a presentation in the following order. I'd like to provide the backgrounds first, and then give an overview of economic security policies, and I pay particular attention to recent Japanese policy on semiconductor industry, And then I try to show how the United States influenced our economic security policies. And then I finish with conclusion and try to discuss where Japan goes from here. Okay. So backgrounds, as many of you, I think you have seen, I'm sorry. I think many of you are familiar with this kind of figure, must have seen this kind of figure a number of times. The rise of China, their share in their presence in the world economy has been growing, and also in the trade, the red line, although it declined a little bit, it is the number one country, number one trading partner for many countries. And also military presence has been going up again, okay? But, and as we have heard so many times in this conference already, Sino-American rivalry has begun under the Trump administration with tariff wars in 2018. And the two countries are imposing more export controls over each other. But I would say Japanese, we became aware of the potential danger of securitization of economic policy by China much earlier than the tension grows between the United States and Japan. And so that I think it is really, we became aware of the danger of securitization of economic policies when the Chinese government restricted exports of rare earth materials to Japan in response when we had disputes over Senkaku Islands in 2010. And then we learned an important lesson from this incident that they can turn in their economic power to pursue their political and security objectives. And so we often, the Japanese government officials and the Japanese scholars often tell our American friends that you became aware a bit too late, okay? And so, and also, Prime Minister Abe says this in his memoir. He warned the rise of China in his first administration. That is when he became prime minister in 2006. But the Americans did not really listen to him. Okay, so and also we have recently seen again. Hold on. How can we go back? Okay, hold on. Again, they did. The Chinese banned Japanese imports of Japanese seafood following the release of so-called treated water from Fukushima nuclear power plants. Okay, so and also when we understand the Japanese economic security policy formulation, it is need to bear in mind that our prime minister's institutional political power has expanded significantly in past 30 years. Because of a series of political reforms, which I have no time to go over. But that is why we have been rather swift and effective in formulating economic policies in recent years. Okay. And so our discussions of over security policies really began around 2017 under Abe administration. And the Suga administrations also continued the discussion, but real policies were formulated by Prime Minister Kishida after he became Prime Minister in 2021. And the first thing, he legislated Economic Security Promotion Act in 2022. And they had 4 pillars. To secure critical materials to run Japanese economy, and safeguard our infrastructure services, and attach more importance to research and development of high-end technologies. And then also we have introduced a confidential patent application system, the confidential patent application system. Okay. And then the government has identified 11, and then we added 1. So so far we have identified 12 critical materials. They include antibiotic, fertilizers, semiconductors, batteries, rare important minerals, and so forth. And the government, the Prime Minister have asked ministries to design plans to ensure the supply of critical materials. And what the ministry did in essence was to provide subsidies to ask companies to, if they are interested in enhancing the production capacities of these critical materials. And if the companies volunteer to increase production, the government subsidizes about 1/3 or 1/2 of the necessary money to make additional investment to increase production capabilities. And then Kishida administration implemented another legislated another important act, which is Important Economic Security Information Act. This is really a law to introduce security clearance assessment system. That is the government, so that government can share confidential information as regards to economic security policies with private companies and private citizens if they, after the government examines their credentials. Okay? And the total amount of subsidies which the government has made ready to secure important critical materials is so far 1.9 trillion yen. This is much less than the amount of financial resources committed by the United States or the EU. Okay. And now let's move on to semiconductor policy. Okay. And this is really the designing formulation of this, the policy aiming at securing and recovering production capabilities of high-end semiconductor chips. It really the Suga administration which initiated discussions or design for designing such a policy. Okay. And so they tried to. So they had two. They had two policy objectives. One was to increase the. They had three. The Suga administration had three objectives. One was to increase the production capacities of existing Japanese conduct firms. Okay. And the second pillar was to attract foreign foundries, namely the TSMC. And the third pillar was to develop new logic semiconductor technology through creation of a new company, Rapidus. Okay. And Kishida administration succeeded in inviting TSMC to Kyushu Island, Kumamoto Prefecture, and TSMC made an announcement to set up a factory by 2024 at the end of 2021. And the Japanese government committed to make subsidies of about 476 billion yen. And the first factory was completed at the beginning of this year. And in the same month, TSMC announced that they would set up another factory in the same prefecture. And the Japanese government pledged to provide 720 billion yen. So this. So by inviting TSMC, Japanese government, I think, is likely to succeed in securing, enhancing production capabilities of high-end semiconductors. Okay. Now, let's go to Rapidus. And I think Mr. Huang, I think he was skeptical of these efforts, but this really, the creation of Rapidus really began by the offer and proposal by the IBM if the Japanese companies are interested in using their technologies to produce the most high-end logic semiconductor chip with 2 nanometers. Okay? And they asked a bunch of Japanese companies, but many Japanese companies kind of wimped out, and they could not make decisions to make a necessary investment to set up a new factory to produce these 2 nanometer logic semiconductors. So 2 Japanese business persons who are in the semiconductor industrial business for many years decided that they would themselves set up a new company called Rapidus. And so the Japanese government welcomed their decisions, and the government decided to back their company. And they announced that they would start constructing a factory in Chitose in Hokkaido. Now it's a northern part. No. So TSMC came to the southern part of Japan, and this Rapidus decided to set up a factory in the northern part of Japan called Hokkaido. And construction began. This is a picture that's showing that this is the site of the construction, and it is going on. Okay, and the Japanese government so far made a commitment, put about 1 trillion, I think about 800 billion yen so far, but it is said that we need 5 trillion yen in total to finance this project. And I think the government is willing to do it. Many people are skeptical about the possible, probability of success, but nonetheless, I think the Japanese government is making a bet on this project. Okay. And so now, influence of United States policies on Japanese economic security, economic security policies. Okay, influence of Chinese. I mean, I think I have already mentioned. I referred to the influence of China. You know, the Japanese became very much afraid of weaponization of economic power by China. So we have made various measures to respond to that possibility. And now let's turn to the United States policies. And my understanding that United States policy, they use 2 types of economic security policies. And I think Americans call them economic stagecraft rather than economic security policies. And there are 2 types. One is promotion, and the other is restriction. And promotion is really to try to develop a particular industry or increase production capabilities of particular products, especially semiconductors. And the restrictions, I think we have gone some of them already. They restrict government procurements, or they impose restrictions on how the government make procurement, or they also impose a number of export controls. Okay. So, I think the first conspicuous case which the United States did for promoting semiconductor industry was the legislation of National Defense Authorization Act. I'm sorry, there is a typo, NDAA of 2021 in January 2021, which they made a commitment to subsidize as much as $300 billion for semiconductor-related projects. And then they got more aggressive with CHIPS and Science Act. I think many of here are familiar with this act. The U.S. administration made a commitment to make 52.7 billion for semiconductor. Now, it's not just for semiconductors, but for other research and development of other items. And among this 50 to 7 billion, $5 billion is specified for semiconductors research and development. And again, the United States government also has succeeded in legislating Inflation Reduction Act, which this aims at targets $78.3 billion for energy and climate change, and especially they try to promote the production of EVs within the United States. Okay. And restrictions, again, they legislated NDAA in 2019, which really banned the United States government agencies and the armed forces from procuring products and services from top 5 Chinese ID companies such as Huawei. And then in next year, they banned, they prohibited US government agencies and armed forces from getting into contract with private companies using parts and devices of these 5 IT Chinese companies. Okay. And then DOC introduced comprehensive export controls in October 2022 on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing related products and devices. Okay. And so, the question is, how did those policies affect the Japanese economic security policy? Okay, so the promotion had some impact on Japanese semiconductor and semiconductor policies, because the Japanese government was tracking the United States policy to subsidize their semiconductor industry, and the Japanese government was very much alerted that if they had not done anything, the Japanese semiconductor industry will really lag behind I mean, in addition to, we are already behind the Taiwanese and Koreans, but we are going to lag even further. So this really prompted the Japanese government to decide to make huge government investment in semiconductor industry. And restrictions, but as regards to overall economic security policies, such as securing 12 critical materials, I don't think the United States government policy really had a significant impact. It was really the concern for weaponization of economic power by the Chinese, which drives the Japanese government to formulate overall economic security policies. And restrictions, following, I think the Japanese government were very loyal to the American government as regards to restrictions. After Americans imposed restrictions, we imposed same kind of restrictions on Japanese companies and Japanese government organizations. Okay. And yes, for example, after the export control imposed by DOC in 2022, Japanese government added restrictions on 23 devices related to semiconductor manufacturing, because we have leading companies such as Tokyo Electron, who have cutting-edge technologies and devices for semiconductor production. Okay. So in conclusion, I say I think so far Japan has made significant progress in overall security policies, and also much progress in enhancing semiconductor production capabilities, but not so clear about Rapidus. Even many Japanese media are skeptical of the Japanese government attempt, but we will find out in a few years if that this company can really obtain production capabilities of logic semiconductors of 2 nanometers. And the influence of US policies, some on promotion, their promotion policy had some impact. And the Japanese followed, as I've said, much in line with in area of restrictions. Now, where does Japan, I will finish soon, about in 1 minute or so. So I think that so far, I think Japan has been rather loyal to American policy. But the real question is, even I think the United States, the tension between the United States and China will rise even further. And I think the United States will continue to impose much more restrictions on, especially targeting semiconductors. And so, for example, and also I think they will start maybe asking the Japanese universities to not to accept researchers from China or students from China in engineering or science. And I'm not sure how the Japanese will respond. And also the Chinese have already reacted to the Japanese following Americans. For example, they have imposed restrictions on the export of gallium and germanium, as well as graphite. Gallium and germanium are indispensable for production of semiconductors. And the Chinese exports to Japan, since last year has reduced to 10%, okay? That's significant. Not by 10%. It became 10% of the previous year. So now the Japanese companies are struggling to obtain gallium and germanium, okay? So, but I would say, so Japan, so as Professor Kua has said, okay, we may go for a bit of third nation strategy, but I would say at the end of the day, we stick with the United States, and probably we would go for more coordination with the United States, EU, and like-minded countries, and be a part of Cold War 2.0. But that will give rise to different problems, which I don't think we have really discussed so far, which is the rise. I mean, if we dare to pay higher prices, we can obtain these critical materials, even including gallium and germanium, and because they are byproducts of production of aluminum. So if we dare to pay higher prices, but that will increase, I call it structural inflation. If we pay higher prices, that push the prices, I mean CPI in many countries up, right? And that will probably have domestic political repercussions. That will probably undermine the quality of people's and living standard. And so we have to balance so we have to be aware of those risks. And also, I wonder how Japan, and not only Japan, United States and Europe continue to subsidize these industries. You know, we have to find some revenues to finance that money, and Japan is in deficit, and United States cannot go on forever to subsidize those money. They have made commitments, so we really have to think about fiscal conditions as well. So so I think it's something. It's easy to talk about decoupling, but really, we have to think about domestic repercussions of decoupling. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a wonderful example of how securitization becomes wrapped up in the process of economic policy. And it seems to me in many ways that the continuum that I spoke about very early on this morning, Japan is very much to one end of that continuum. I thought it was also interesting when you were talking about back in 2010 already, Japan had become clear about the way China was willing to use policy in terms of sanctioning, which it always claimed it didn't, but has now become a very obvious tool that China uses to punish those that it doesn't agree with. Norway was an obvious example when it awarded Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo, and of course Australia when it dared to call for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID. But let me now turn to our discussants, and first Professor Zhang is the Zhu Yunhan Chair, Professor Taipei School of Economics and Political Science, and also the class of 1935, Professor of Government, Emeritus College of William and Mary.
Thank you, Chair. This panel is focused on how nations in this region wrestle with the challenges of economic security and deal with the reconfiguring of the global supply chains. All three papers and or presentations are truly insightful. I learned quite a bit. I just want to make sort of three comments accordingly. My first comment is about the shift from the decoupling to de-risking the strategy, which is a very general point that Professor Mendoza made in his forthcoming articles in International Advances in Economic Research. And also a point he also made before diving into the Filipino cases in this paper written for this conference. Professor Mendoza's point on the three tasks and the two requirements for the de-risking, I believe is very well taken. The three tasks, right? Avoid being economic ties being sort of weaponized or disrupted, and to become sort of hurdles for a national development goal. And two sort of requirements, internally, state intervention, and externally, sort of collective actions among like-minded nations and their firms. I think, no question about it, I think that this is very well sort of kind of made arguments there. The question I have for him is, it's not really for him, perhaps for the G7 country, is whether the decoupling as a strategy for the actors out there, and also for as a concept for us here as analysts. Okay, probably has been sort of pushed out all too prematurely, and perhaps not sincerely. If we discuss a descent, for example, from the national level of analysis to a sector level analysis, or even further down to the firm level analysis, well, decoupling may still make sense, and indeed is arguably probably been pursued vigorously. For some sectors, and some people touched upon this early this morning, such as AI, high-end semiconductors, and so on, and the United States, probably not saying it, but probably would like to see complete decoupling from China. But so for some other sectors, PCs, iPhones, yes, and so on, maybe the G7's announcement in sort of de-risking rather than replacing a decoupling probably makes sense there. I know for fact that a couple of the multinational corporations my nephew's working for, really have sort of clustered their operations in China and decoupled it from the operation from the rest of China. Most likely sort of based in Japan. The dean, former dean of the TSE, Tian Zhichen, also made this observation in other settings there. So I'm wondering, if we are throwing out sort of the decoupling, as a concept, as a strategy, out of the bathtub, all too quickly, probably. The other questions I have for Professor Mendoza is about the significance of the G7, the May 23 declarations, which you make a big points in the forthcoming essays there. It seems to me that the geopolitics, according to you, cannot trump the geoeconomics, and that the economic gravity, trade flows, the thrust of the transnational investment, cross borders, the technological ties are just all too entrenched, all too dynamics, all too sort of the vigorous to be overruled by game plans or major moves in the geopolitical chessboard. Here, I'm sort of wondering whether if we need to look more carefully about which regions we are talking about. maybe there's some kind of the sub-regional differences in our part of the world here in Asia. If you, for example, look at Northeast Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, and perhaps we can kick in the Philippines, these are probably more amenable, more vulnerable, if you like, to the United States geopolitical persuasions or even pressure. And the majority of Southeast Asian nations are probably much less so there. Instead, probably more inclined to push back the United States geopolitical calculus there. As you know well, Northeast Asia plus the Philippines, the adversaries right in the front yard or at the doorstep there. So they needed to deter, and who is going to help them to deter as the United States? While the majority of the Southeast Asian nations have the sort of a putative, not necessarily real or present, clear there, putative threats far off the coast, if there ever is. And hence probably can afford to sort of a hedge between Beijing and Washington, D.C., the way that Northeast Asian nation and the Philippines cannot. Yeah. So that's sort of my humble comments. My second comments are probably more sort of related to the Takenaka-san's presentation and papers. Seems to me that pertains to probably we can argue a new trend or new development of the role of the state, which is actually Professor Mendoza's probably also touch upon. I think we are probably today seeing the repurposing of the state. And if you like, probably we are seeing the advent of the economic security state. That's called ESS. Okay. So many of us in this room are political scientists by training, political economists. We are all too familiar with the, all kind of states floating around there in the literature. ANU, Australian National University, had both territorial state, whether it's empire or nations, And then we heard about sort of, the Cornell University, Richard Rosenkranz trading state, not territorial state, but trading state, trying to play by the ex-ante rules and keep doing well, and out there in an economical sort of a liberalizing world. And then we heard about sort of Michigan's Ronald Engelhardt's post-industrial state, sort of trying to very busy, sort of translating, if you like, post-materials of values into some sort of palatable policies there. For our region here, the most popular state is developmental state, which of course is sort of kind of conceptualized by UC Berkeley's Chalmers Johnson, using Japan as a sort of a paradigmatic case there, developmental state, which is goal-driven, of course, which has a mission to grow economies, transform and upgrade industries, and in most cases, fairly effective there. And of course, here Japan offered the sort of a prototype, and South Korea and Taiwan adopted, and later on, so did most East and Southeast Asian nations there. And the developmental state has been sort of a credit, for the sort of the Asian economic performance there. Today, however, we seem to be seeing sort of an economic security state emerging there. And again, probably invented by Japan in Japan, and probably likely to be replicated elsewhere in Asia. And of course, as Takenaka's presentation shows, it's a long time coming. It started out with China's embargoes on of minerals exports to Japan and things of the sort, right? But I think the output there, it's really, visibly, for us to see, there, which is that a very well-designed economic security state, and taking shape probably in 2022 during the Fumio Kishida's administrations there. So the state that Takenaka-san described and is emerging in Japan, how does it look like? Well, its mission is risk management. Its task is quite well specified. Today, for example, 11 plus 1 sort of a kind of a key ingredients, you got to have it in there in Japan. Second, the structure of the ESS that is emerging there, it's centralized. Centralized and also, clearly sort of assigned to persons attached to the Prime Minister's office there. And third ingredient of the state that is being constructed there, described by the Takenaka-san, is that its main instrument is not the good old days administrative guidance, but rather incentives, subsidies, sort of a massive way. My questions to Takenaka-san is this. If you compare today's state with the state yesterday, capitalist state, developmental state, would today's ESS states, be as effective as its predecessors or not? I think probably we'll see some question marks there. The first one is that the old state there has had a sort of a kind of a consensual support from the society. There's consensus on what development state should be doing, and wanted to do and should be doing there. And but that's opened up for the debate, what the ESS should be doing, right? And second, public opinions probably in the past have given sort of a free hand, if you like, high degree of freedom, for the developmental state, to lay out a plan, to marshal sort of the resources and deploy it to sunrise sectors, that sort of things there. But you probably, the security states in Japan probably are not giving that kind of wide latitudes there. Degree of freedom, if you like, for the ESS is much, much narrower than the more controversial than the sort of development state there. And third question mark here has to do with resources there. Developmental state create resource, expand GDP pies, generate 2 or 3% there. When the tide is rising, everybody's happy. Now ESS is spending state, spending money. You are not creating new resources. You are snatching resources from other sectors to take care of this question, which is security. So it's going to be very, very, I believe, debatable, controversial, and so on. So I'm sort of doubting, whether the ESS, will be as effective as the the developmental state there. The final comment, very brief one, has to do with the China. We forgot that China also has to manage economic security. It's not just a target itself, it also has to face that task, right? It's not just, sort of the outsiders here facing, rising China there, therefore has to, sort of embrace this the most important task there. China has to manage that as well. So looks like from the presentation that I've heard by the Professor Schiappo, the state, the government, the economy as a whole seems to be coping up, with that task well, seems to be managing well. I happened to read an article published a few months ago by an economist, by an engineer turned economist at Zhejiang University, saying that not so with private sectors. Not so with private sector. And he used the sort of the A-list companies, in Shanghai Stock Exchange, and for some sort of a 10 years observation there. And he used this indicator, to say that, well, the private sector is not doing quite well in the age of economic security and trade and the tension, geopolitical tensions there. Chinese companies are not sort of coping with the geopolitical risk that well. And the reason he said that is that Chinese companies no longer so well performing for its goal to internationalize itself, expanding its trade scope, uplifting its trade, some items, going upscale, sort of upgrading trade, expanding investment, the network, through which you can indeed learn more when it comes to technology, that sort of thing there. So he said if you use that yardsticks, well, Chinese companies are not doing quite well. The geopolitical risk really hurt the Chinese companies' internationalization, the performance. And the two sort of reasons for that is that the two mechanisms for this kind of poor performance internationally is that the geopolitical risk reduce Chinese companies' legitimacy as bona fide traders or co-investors. And second is the decline of investments of opportunity sets for Chinese companies there. Of course, Chinese companies try to come up with some mitigation strategies there. And three mitigations, of course, diversified sort of the products, diversify technology, and diversify sort of kind of partners out there. And he said that there's some sort of some sort of good result for products, the diversification. The technological diversification is yet to be seen, whether it's working or not. And the most interesting part for me is his finding for the third mitigation strategy, which is to, sort of a partnership of diversification. And the finding here shows that diversification made with BRI in Global South countries, bridge and road initiative countries, did not work. Somehow implying that so partnership diversification with Global North, maybe United States was still work. And I'm just wondering why. But the general question here is that why the public sector seems to be doing well, the nations as a whole is doing well, but not the leading firms in China in coping with the sort of geopolitical risk. I will end up here. Thank you.
And our last comment is from Hans Tong, who's the University Excelsior Chair Professor of Political Science at the National Taiwan University. So,
thank you. It's great actually to listen to all the three presentations and learn a great deal from them. So I basically have two major questions, well, essentially for kind of everyone, wondering if you have any responses to these two. So well, the first one is that, well, sitting here listening to all these presentations and also thinking about the issue of geopolitics and supply chain, I was thinking about, the kind of classic literature on IPE, especially on this connection, the nexus between geopolitics and trade. We were taught, especially from the grad school, that there are security externalities, right? So basically, trade or investments, across countries, they are welfare enhancing, but at the same time, if there is certain kind of alliance structure, ex ante, then you could have this kind of externalities happening, and you don't want to trade with your enemies. And therefore, the kind of conclusion from that literature is that, well, if countries do take that into consideration, then they will just trade with their allies, and then, of course, stop trading with their enemies. So that's something we learned. And recently, I think I came across another paper showing it's not just about countries inside one single alliance, but also that kind of effect can actually extend beyond just the alliance inside the countries inside the alliance, but also can be extended to the alliance of the alliance. And this can also, this kind of structure can also have effects. And somehow, in my previous paper on arms trade, it seems that there are also such a network effect in terms of how countries trade with each other, according to their alliances. But somehow, especially from today's perspective, especially in this kind of conference, these kind of general findings, it seems that they might not help much in terms of making policies for specific countries. And the reason is, this kind of literature, in a sense, assumes that there's a pretty well-defined alliance structure out there. And if you want to de-risk, if you want to avoid, any kind of exigencies, you can just, safely trade with your friends. And again, like-minded countries, right? But seriously, but these are very vague terms, right? When it comes to national policy making, then, of course, there are some obvious cases where you know who your allies are. But sometimes, I guess, because we are now here in Taiwan, well, Taiwan is a very ambiguous case. It's an informal ally, I suppose, with a lot of countries, but at the same time, it's not a formal ally. So I guess when everything, this kind of theory applies to Taiwan, then for example, recently in various American attempts to do this kind of friendshoring or de-risking, whether Taiwan is included seems to be a question. Even though on rhetoric, I suppose most of the State Department officials would kind of view Taiwan as a partner of the United States, but sometimes you can see in some policy attempts, Taiwan wasn't included. So, and therefore, there's some kind of, again, ambiguities here. And therefore, I was wondering, so obviously there are some economic policies we can make to make it more rational, to make it less risky. But I was wondering, according to your expertise and your experiences, do countries also make efforts in the area of the alliance building? So it's not just about economic policy, but also about like, in terms of the security or soft security area, do countries for example, in Philippines, Japan, or when you're in Afra's case, or Germany, or your expertise in China, well, of course, China is a different case. But so what kind of policy efforts would you predict these countries to do? So that probably would be my first question. And the second question is a little bit, allow me to kind of piggyback on Professor Chen's question a little bit, because he did mention this idea about, what various different theories of state, right? Indeed, he gave us a pretty good summary. There are so many different variants of states that, political scientists coin as a concept. And when you mentioned this idea of economic security state, obviously this is very related to the question I just mentioned, and I was wondering, in the spirit of, for example, we also mentioned Danny Roderick this morning, right? And in that book of his, he mentioned this, you have hyper globalization, and so that he has like very nice triangles. I think that's kind of like a variant of the impossible trinity in international finance. And so in that kind of idea, sometimes the response to that, especially from the domestic political perspective, we have another concept called embedded liberalism, right? So to overcome the potential risks from engaging in global trade and finance, well, sometimes countries, they will have policies to help people who suffer from the fluctuations in the world market and kind of, or the pooling of risks in a society. So that's kind of, in a way, what embedded liberalism is about. So, but that kind of risks obviously are about economic, right? So in the process of globalization, some people gain and some people lose, and then countries or governments can help them. But in this case of economic security, we're thinking about not that kind of, the job losses or because of the economic fluctuations in the world market, but we're thinking about national security risks. So this is a different kind of risk. And so I wonder if, when Professor Chen mentioned this idea of economic security state, to flash that concept a bit more, what kind of policies, kind of in equivalence with the policies that people have come up with under the rubric of embedded liberalism, and what kind of policy do you think nations and countries can adopt to help? It's hard to think, right? Because it's sometimes, when people, for example, lose their job because their companies or factories were driven out of business because of some foreign competition, right? So we have had lots of examples, like in the United States, you have like kind of trade adjustments bill to help firms or factories to restructure its production and make it more efficient. For people, you could have unemployment insurances. So I mean, we have all kinds of policy suggestions and proposals out there for addressing that kind of issues. But for this kind of, I don't know, international security type of risks, how could we, or how in your, I don't know, in your wild imaginations, what countries can do to address them? So that would be my two cents and also questions for you guys. Thank you.
We have some time, so I think before asking panelists to sum up, we have some time if there are comments or questions from the floor. Danny, if you want to start.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Really wonderful panel. I have two quick questions, if I may. The first is, I wonder if in some of this discussion, we are giving geopolitics far too much blame at the same time that we're giving it far too much credit. When for instance, we hear descriptions about how the Chinese government subsidizes this or practices that, or America, through the Inflation Reduction Act, subsidizes EVs, that's a purely economic act. The fact that there's a distortion in the marketplace and then subsequently there's a round of tariffs or other actions does not make that geopolitics. And it seems to me that it's almost like everything that's not taking place in the normal play of trade, we have lumped into geopolitics. And then we say, oh, then economics and geopolitics are pulling off in different directions here. I don't find that very respectful of geopolitics. It's almost like geopolitics is the recycling catch-all container into which we put everything we don't like about economic actions by governments. So I wonder if it's helpful if we can clarify the distinction that way. A second is, I find that we are now talking about Cold War 2.0. That seeped into the conversation. And I fully was on board when Professor Wu this morning talked about dividing the world into camps, looking at each other through the lens of only great power competition, everybody having to take sides, and all of that I fully buy into. But one of the features of the original Cold War was that many American households were confronted not just with the threat of nuclear annihilation, but with the specter of, if the other side wins, we will not be able to live life the way that we have become used to. And I wonder if in calling this possibility a Cold War, we have lost sight of how valid that point remains. There's no question that the PRC is a bully. It's a bully on Australia. It's a bully on all kinds of Nobel Prizes awarded. It's a bully on, arguably, the South China Sea. But does anyone here really believe that anybody in Beijing cares about how the American Midwest live their lives and whether they hold elections or not? I suggest not. And I suggest that if that's the case, we need to be much more circumspect about putting everything into a Cold War playbook. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony.
Amy?
I just have a very simple question. I think it's related to Professor Takenaka's comment about structural inflation and high cost of industrial policy for Japan, and I would say for every advanced economy. We have been talking about geopolitics, as Danny was saying. I would like to talk a bit more about economics because, there should be some checks and balances between basic economic principles and, securitization of whatever policies. When the cost of subsidizing an industry or putting a high tariff on goods from China becomes so high, there got to be some pushback from ordinary people or even from politicians. But it seems that we may not get to that stage yet. But I guess, when inflation becomes 5, 6, 7% per year, I don't think, American citizens would say it's okay to have like 35, 40% tariffs on China. Or maybe I'm wrong. People are just so focused on their identity, so focused on their culture, and they don't care about, paying 20, 30% higher prices for the goods from other countries. I just want to hear, any comments or suggestions about what I just said.
Thank you. I just would love to hear from anyone in the panel if you think that, since we're at the beginning of economic security measures, that there may be a dynamic going on where obviously there'll be a tit-for-tat responses. And can we see, therefore, the economic security measures a bit like an arms race, where each action taken by one side is having a security negative impact on the other, and obviously they're going to respond. So in that sense, it could be similar to protectionist measures when Smoot-Hawley tariff, as designed in 1928 in the presidential campaign and finally passed 1930, made sense as long as Canada doesn't reply by making an alliance with the UK and cutting all links with the US, as it did, right? So in the end, Smoot-Hawley tariff was a disaster because of the response by everyone else. So in economic security, is there a sweet spot where not going too far, not getting into a dynamic? Is there actually an end point, or is there a risk of spillover? Because once you do chips, once you do AI, you're going to have to do something else, autonomous vehicle. Then you have to do maybe all the EVs and so on, right? Is there a way to circumscribe that small yard, high fence, or otherwise, how do we get to the sweet spot? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right at the back. I think you're going to have to either move down or shout.
Good afternoon, panel. Thank you for the presentations. I have two quick questions. How will the geopolitics upgrade the partnership for global infrastructure and investment plan and prove a strong rival for the BRI by China's in terms of OFDI? And the second is the new foreign investment law, which was passed by China, has removed the clause of technology transfers and opened up several sectors from the negative list. So will FDI and economic interests of many businessmen and investors in the US and the rival countries to China overtake the geopolitical tensions that are happening in the world and provide a strong buffer between political rivalry? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think we'll give each of our panelists 5 minutes to respond to whatever they want to respond to. Ronald, let me start with you.
There is a lot to respond to, so I'll just pick a few ideas. I agree with Dean Danny, actually, when he sort of observes that we put a lot too much on the boogeyman of geopolitics. Basically, I just started to think about it. Bad economics is bad economics, but geopolitics makes it a little, there's an argumentation behind it, right? Because, there's a risk element, and so, yeah, expensive subsidies on something that may or may not work suddenly now becomes, a little bit more palpable and defensible, right? So you bring back industries, you sort of, as Professor Tanaka showed us, spend a lot on some of these investments, and not all of them may succeed. And of course, what you have crowded out are many other investments, including for global public goods, things that, of course, Dean Danny talked about this, the win-wins that our generation is supposed to solve. And that becomes a casualty because of many of these types of expenditures. It crowds out, becomes smaller, right? Our appetite for making those bold investments that are supposed to really recalibrate the way we live and work in today's world, this is receiving less attention. And again, wearing the UN sort of hat, since I sit in the Secretary General's Committee of Experts on Public Administration, many of the SDGs are actually under threat of not being achieved, right? And instead, we are spending a lot on some of these things and veering away from very cost-effective ways of, producing renewable energy and so on and so forth. So completely agree with Dean Danny here that bad economics is bad economics, but what is confounding us right now is this geopolitics angle to it. And that is why I think the next generation of economists, including those you're training here in this school, really needs to have a firm grasp of that political economy. That you must not only be strong on the economic side, but also navigating what is now being used as an argumentation yet again. This is not a new thing. Actually, it's part of maybe a global cycle, and it's coming back into the policy space. For instance, de-risking. I'll spend a few minutes on this. I was talking to a German delegation who visited the Philippines recently, and they were trying to pick our brains on, possibly thinking about us as a potential solution to their de-risking, and then also for our own thinking of our own de-risking. So the two sides, right, for a country like the Philippines. And of course, their famous example is that pipeline that goes all the way to someone they used to trust and, trusted less after some actions, and then they discovered that a chunk of their energy is coming from this particular supplier, right? And they wanted to veer away from nuclear. Remember this famous sort of pivot by Germany and to renewables. And then they ended up sort of putting a lot of their eggs on that basket. So I think here we were sort of brainstorming on this, and I wondered, essentially the de-risking argument is part economics but part political. You're not going to totally de-risk 50, 100 products in your entire economy. You're going to look at those products, you're going to look at where they're produced, you're going to look at the different groups that will be threatened or impacted if anything actually disturbs these production chains or products. And then you're going to look at the power and agency of those groups. If it comes from a very powerful region in Germany that tends to have a strong voice in their parliament, like there is this famous example where there was a risk to cut exports of a certain type of pork coming from a certain region in Germany. And if they are actually disproportionately powerful in that political alliance, then this pork product will receive a lot of attention in the de-risking discussion. So you can have different cuts on this, and it seemed to me that our tools as economists will be useful to restore some kind of discipline on the discussion. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at de-risking, you're going to look at preferences for risk, and you're going to look at groups. And so it's going to be this iterative, slightly dirty process, sort of organizing, where your collective action will be as a country to try and de-risk. Because there is no such thing as total de-risking. If it were, then it would be decoupling maybe. So you totally absorb all of those costs, and it doesn't make sense either, right? So I think that's a key. There was a very intriguing idea, and I'll end with this thought on the economic security state. And maybe if there is a value added to this, post-globalization era where we're thinking about where we're going to take the world today, with all of the polycrises that we are facing, I think it is really inclusion, right? You have to think about inclusion because that's where the credibility of this new sort of system will be drawn from. And it's inclusion in different ways. I was actually inspired by the presentation of our colleague earlier that maybe some of this actually redounding better to many other countries that are now being included in value chains because that's part of the recalibration, right? If they step up, if the comparative advantages are there, then maybe they temper the impact on inflation and the other things that we don't want to get in there. But then you also develop new comparative advantages in some of these areas, and then you get new champions. Like Vietnam is actually a good champion for EVs, or Malaysia is a good champion for semiconductors. And who knows where they will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And this diversifies the world. Like before it was just a few countries or big giants. Now it is no longer this, and maybe that is a model. I don't have the answers, but maybe that is a model for a better type of globalization, more inclusive type. On the domestic side, I think it is crucial, mission imperative, that the institutions that we build will actually start to think about our various parts of the population, sort of including, for instance, this model where technology actually tends to polarize populations, right? Some which have the technology, and then a vast majority that may not. So you have to think of institutions so that those who do not will not be forgotten. So you probably need new mechanisms to sort of bring them in. Make sure this era of globalization is, not pretty much the same type of globalization as before, only with sort of a boogeyman sort of included in the discussion. Thank you.
Alfred?
Thank you for many good questions, and I don't think we have all the answers to that, but maybe a few comments. I think on this question about do we overuse the term geopolitics to explain basically everything? I think there are certain elements that are truly different today. One that we haven't really discussed is the broader issue of a country challenging the dominance of another one. That is a trend, and that I think has at least partly driven the geopolitical confrontation, irrespective of subsidies, irrespective of anything else, that would still be in the room. And we saw that in the 1980s when China was on Japan was on a path to potentially overtaking the United States. So I think that is a structural issue where history is not very kind in how countries deal with that. The second part, I think there is less question about is the confrontation between, or the war in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That has created a certain geopolitical dynamic. Again, that has nothing to do with anything else. That's truly, are you with me or are you against me? And then, of course, then comes a big bucket where you have almost everything. And I think here the key is that we did not pay attention enough to the distributional implications of globalization, trade, certain groups being neglected. And even today, when we look at the, we have de-risking, decoupling, let's call it recoupling. We have a recoupling actually happening as we speak. We mentioned Vietnam, Mexico, maybe Indonesia, many others in the process, potentially even Brazil. It turns out, though, that that is not driven by politics. This is actually driven by commercial interests of business that find their space in this convoluted world, managing their risks in order to find opportunities. Now, eventually, politics might take over again. So I don't know whether the Vietnam-Mexico story is the end of the story. I have doubt if there is going to be a new president in the White House, for example, next year, that Mexico will continue with what it has done before. And I think even the Biden, potentially Harris administration will react to that, could also be. But again, what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of space, and we have focused very much on the public political side, but the business community is trying to manage this and creates opportunity. And maybe some of that can be codified ex post, maybe not ex ante. On the question about whether private companies are doing worse in China to dealing with this as opposed to state-owned enterprises, I have doubts whether the data would support that. So, for example, if we take the BRI, it was all SOEs that went to Africa Invest and literally came back and said, oh my gosh, we really screwed up. So it was not the private sector at the time. I think what is true is that the current de-risking strategy by private and public companies are extremely costly. You're basically replicating your entire capacity in order to have China plus one. In the short term, that is not going to be helpful for profitability. So the verdict is out whether that investment was truly a smart investment or not. So I think one has to look at the data a little bit more carefully. And then there was a question about some of the actions on the Chinese side to encourage basically businesses to come to China. Is this going to happen or not? I think the biggest concern that the business community has is not the rules and regulations that are in place today, even if they're bad. It is the uncertainty of what will happen tomorrow. Because if I'm a company now moving into China because I'm attracted by the new policies, and then the day after there's going to be a policy imposed either for my actions in the country or my operations in a third country, I might hold off. So the biggest challenge right now is that when people talk about, small yards and high fences, nobody could give you the answer, what is the yard and what is the fence? And people who do game theory would tell you, and we don't want to tell you that. We like that ambivalence because we want to keep you on your toes. that is bad for business, and that's bad for economics. I've been arguing, we have been talking about how to get to know. Basically, every country is asking itself, how can we get to know? The question, I think, for us should basically be, how can we potentially get to yes? Yes, there is a fence, but how high? Yes, there is a yard, but how big? And so I think the whole narrative, hopefully, at some point, starts changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very important questions and tough questions. And let me address the questions raised by Professor Chen and Hans about this economic security state. I think, and it addresses the questions raised by Professor Kua and Eve, and also Professor Tan. So I think ESS has common elements with development state, in that state plays a significant role in developing a specific industrial sector. But it is different from, ESS is different from development state, in that its purpose is to avoid dependence on particular country for production of particular devices or particular materials, okay? And we should make this definition very clear to avoid the abusive use of geopolitics, okay? I would say, so then the number comes into play. So how much dependence? 50%, 60%, 70%? I would say 90%, 80% is dangerous. So for now, I think we can make it, if you are dependent on particular country for supply of some materials, devices, 50%, more than 50%, then you should address that situation. Okay? That is why Taiwan position is ambiguous, because if you control 90% of these high-end logic semiconductor chips, that poses potential dangers for other countries, right? Well, China might not invade Taiwan, but earthquake might hit Taiwan, and it might knock down the TSMC factories. Then the stock market price will go down, and we'll have severe problems of supply chains of semiconductors. So to avoid that kind of situation, we have ESS, I think. And if we define that as clearly as, the purpose of ESSS or a purpose of mobilization of economic security policy, then we can avoid abusive use of the geopolitics, okay? And also, I think Eve has the same problems and has the same issues in his mind. And to bring down these figures from 90% to 50%, I think that might cause structural inflation. But I think I don't know, I think it will depend on how much inflation it will cause. Maybe it may be bearable, maybe too much. But I think we might count on technological innovation because I think if we look at the history of these products, the history is just to bring the price down, right? By means of finding cheaper resources or finding more effective way of production. So I think it will take some time, but I think I think many countries have become aware that too much dependence on, not only on China, on Taiwan, or the Americans are doing the same, with, I think the book is written by Farrell and Newman, How America Weaponized the World Economy, because they monopolize on the telecommunication and the financial services. So I think that's the issue. So we should set a target. I don't know we should, but I think maybe the setting clear objectives by numerical numbers might make discussions easier. Okay. That's my point.
So please join me in thanking our three panelists and two discussants for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.